So psychedelics have this utility for understanding how the mind works, how the brain produces the mind, or the mind interacts with the brain, or whatever the hell's going on, right? So this is a good doorway into maybe isolating pieces of perception and so forth. And that's really interesting for humanity in general. I think that's proving to be interesting. But we also just sort of skipped over the fact that these things can cure people of lifelong addictions, right? That's crazy. And they're illegal substances. You can't buy ibogaine over the counter to cure your cigarette addiction, but you can buy cigarettes over the counter. So like, this is very, very bizarre. And it seems like a real awesome piece of the puzzle for humanity to keep these things at least in our attention, or at least in our peripheral attention.
What do we do with them in practical terms in society, right? That's part of what you're asking. Like, okay, so now all of that's cool, but like also there's like the engineering side of it, I guess. Like, where does it lead? So I think one of the fundamental reasons why these substances are not like nearly as society-wide acceptable for big societies is their unpredictable nature. Is that we don't know, and this ties it into the non-pharmacological things as well, because the non-pharmacologicals at least tend to be a lot more understandable. They're a lot simpler in terms of their mechanism, and in many of them at least, right? That's why right now Rituals, the cosmetics company, open up these things they call mind spas, where you essentially have like a Denilatron, right? It's like vibration and binaural beats and flickering lights, and they tell you, they're like, oh, this is all science-based, but they don't reference any science. But they basically sell it to you as, oh, it's like meditation, but you don't need to learn it and you don't need to do anything. You just get into the box and then it does the meditation effect for you. Yeah. It's like all these, they literally say like all these top athletes use meditation and that's how they're so cool. And you're also a top athlete behind your laptop. And that's where you should also have those benefits, but nobody has the time. So just get an hour box and then you get all the benefits of meditation, but you don't need to learn anything. When you look at what psychedelics actually did make it into like somewhat scalable into culture in terms of therapeutics, it's ketamine. Ketamine, yeah. That's the one where you really see like in part it's a dissociative, which fundamentally means that it's dissolving your sense of self in many ways. Like dissociation is a hard topic to talk about in terms of how you understand it, but really there's very little fear and anxiety associated with these ketamine trips because essentially there's one way of thinking about it that there's nothing to be afraid for because your sense of self, the thing that you would worry about, is kind of dissolving, right? So you're like, well, all this crazy shit is happening, but like there's no like that's just how it is. It's more like a dream, right? Yeah. It's very much related to more like a dream type state. It's also really hard to keep memory of these things because you're dissociated. They're not getting integrated properly. It's very much more to think about as like a dream state. And part of why MDMA, even if it does get approved, wouldn't have that big of an effect, in my opinion, is because it takes too long. It's too long acting. It would be really expensive. It would take you like 20 to 30 grand to go through that protocol. And how do you make sure that you're ready for it? That's, if you go back, it's where we finally invoke William James and his religious conversion therapies. Like one of the key things that comes out of his research is that there's a lot of subconscious processing that's going on, and then there's a trigger, and that leads to the transformation. But how do you tell of somebody if the subconscious processing has been done, right? If they're ready for a phase transition, right? And literally it's like this idea of a phase transition, that there's a lot of processing happening that you cannot really see yet, and then you need the right trigger, and then you have a conversion. But if you can't really do that, it's not by default going to be that helpful. So it's going to be really expensive. You need really long sessions. It's just logistics of it don't check out to me, really. With ketamine, what you get is you don't really get the anxiety and you don't even need therapy during it because it's just the experience. So what they have is they call them pump and dump clinics, where you go in, you get the drip, you sort of plug in for an hour and then you go home. And there's like basically no therapy that goes along with that. And part of why they say this is still going to do the trick is because of this magical concept of neuroplasticity, where neuroplasticity is this idea that you can make new connections in your brain and you can like chemically induce that there's, you can like increase the chance of making new connections. That sounds great. You can like rewire your brain. Awesome. Problems with that. First, nobody has ever shown that the amount of neuroplasticity that, as far as I know, that the amount of neuroplasticity that gets induced with these substances in the human brain is actually significant. You have like some test tube results that's like yes, it does induce some neuroplasticity in some cultures, but does that mean the doses that we're giving to people actually does any significant amount in people is really hard to test. And as far as I know, nobody has done that. Secondly, neuroplasticity is not just by psychedelics. You can take a cold shower or like anything surprising. Like there's a lot of ways to induce neuroplasticity. They might not be as long lasting as those. And I'm not saying that it's wrong to say that it's important, but it's not being put into context well enough. And the third and most important thing is that neuroplasticity is neutral. It allows you to make negative connections just as well as it allows you to make positive connections. And it really is like invoked as this like magical term oftentimes because it makes you think like, oh, my brain is going to grow, so it's going to be better. And it's like, no. So the thing about ketamine, what it's really great at, and where it's even approved for in Germany, is like acute suicidality. Like it seems to be really magical at releasing this like idea that you want to kill yourself, these suicidal ideations, which kind of makes sense if you don't care about yourself anymore because it's kind of dissolved. You're like, well, you get out of this loop if you think about it.
If you have like an episode.
Yeah, exactly. It can break you out of that loop because there's no reason to kill something that you don't care about as much anymore. That would be one simplistic way to think about it. Whether it's correct or not, I don't know. But it really does seem to work really well and really reliably for acute suicidal ideations. The other thing is that it seems to be pretty reliable. These ketamine therapy protocols are usually you get like 6 to 8 sessions within the span of like 2 weeks, where you go into a clinic, you get hooked up for an hour, and then you go home. And there's not much preparation or integration for the most part because that's the best business model. It's pump and dump. You just come in, you get the plug, you go home. It's cheap, and it sort of seems to be effective at raising your baseline, like reducing your baseline depression quite significantly for around like 3 months, and then it sort of tapers off. Which, what that should tell you is that that's the period of time that you can use to make changes in your life, because the depression is not just in you. Most of the time, it's part of your circumstances. It's your social circle, it's your surroundings, it's your habits. Like it really can be really important to think about yourself as being embodied in your daily routines. The more often you do something, even the simple things like for the fucking choice of your pillow or whatever it is, right? Those are part of your sense of self. And you have like, there's a lot of reinforcement from the world, which is part of why we can go on these wild, chaotic journeys and become a coherent self again. It's because our self is not just in us. It's also, it like feeds back from our surroundings, right? You can wake up and you're like kind of confused, like, oh, well, I had a wild dream, but you see your room and the people you know, and like all of that feeds back to your sense of self. But it also means if you have this period where your baseline gets raised, use it to make changes in your actual life, and those can have really good long-lasting results. That's where you get the trajectory effects, right? Like even small changes can, on the long term, really do something. So that's where I think that's the way these ketamine therapies could really be beneficial.
It's like you're setting up a formative period. You know, people always talk about like coming of age stories, like you know, Hollywood movies, or like the kid goes through this journey, and the girl and the bad guys, and you like have this formative period when you're in your youth. But you can have formative periods beyond your youth as well, right? And maybe that's through like something terrible, but it seems like these experiences set you up to have a period of formative transition.